what I want to try and do is briefly introduce you to the Museum of Modern Art as an idea and to situate the institution in the context of the 21st century. And to do that, let me start by just showing you an aerial view of the city of New York with Central Park, that wonderful green space in the middle of Manhattan, which is just to the north of the Museum of Modern Art, which here on a map you can see here. The Museum of Modern Art needs to be understood first and foremost as an idea, and secondarily as a physical reality. The idea, which has given the institution its traction, is that modern art, what its founders meant by the art of our time, what today we would call contemporary art, is every bit as powerful, interesting, and important as the art of the past. And in 1929, when the Museum of Modern Art was founded, that idea that the present could be as interesting as the past was radical. And I show you the first custom-built building of the Museum of Modern Art, designed and opened in 1939, 10 years after we were founded. We were founded in the fall of 1929, right after the great stock market crash. And a decade later, we commissioned Philip Goodwin and Edward Durrell Stone to build us our first permanent custom-designed home. In one of the aspects of this building that I've always found so interesting is its aspirational commitment to the future, to a New York that hadn't even been built yet. And you can begin to sense that by looking at the roof, which is where we actually announced who we were, because New York was in the midst of becoming a vertical city. It hadn't yet been a vertical city, but it was about to be a profoundly vertical city. And so the institution, in a way, already was positioning itself for the future. At the same time, it drew its roots, its origins, to an older model, to the Bauhaus, that great institution that Alfred Barr, the museum's founding director, had visited in 1927 in Dessau. And the Bauhaus was essentially a school that looked at the interdisciplinarity of the arts. It was also the subject of a recent and brilliant exhibition that Barry Bergdahl and several of his colleagues worked on at the Museum of Modern Art. Offering a fresh look, the exhibition did, at this extraordinarily important, and you see here, renovated center. But what Alfred Barr, our founding director, took away from the Bauhaus was instrumental in the creation of the Museum of Modern Art, in realizing that idea that the art of our time could be as important and engaging as the art of the past. And what he took away was, one, the singular importance of living artists, practicing, breathing, living artists, to the centrality of an art museum. If you think about the great museums of the past, the Louvre, for instance, in Paris, or the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, all of the artists represented there are dead. Whereas the artists to be represented at the Museum of Modern Art were alive and were to be alive. And the other thing he took away from it was this notion that all of the arts, whether it was painting or sculpture, film or music, photography, prints, drawings, were all related to each other. And so instead of creating an institution that had a historical framework, he created an institution that was devised along different media. And you can see here some of our great classic works, whether it is a painting by Matisse or a film by Eisenstein or a photograph by Andreas Gursky or a video made by Lida Abdul, or my favorite object, the Cisitalia, one of the first post-Second World War production cars made in Italy. All of these different elements could live under one roof and could share a set of aesthetic and intellectual values. Although each might have their own history, seen together, Barr believed they could be greater than the sum of their parts. And that idea is what gave rise to the Museum of Modern Art. Our challenge, Barry's and mine and all of our colleagues, is to figure out how to keep that idea vibrant and alive in the 21st century. Because if you think about the idea of an institution created for the present, back in 1929, we're now 80 years old. We're in advanced middle age, or maybe we're in early late age. And for us to stay fresh means that we have to constantly reinvent ourselves. So the first thing we did was we commissioned Yoshio Taniguchi, Japanese architect, to literally redesign the Museum of Modern Art for the 21st century and opened this building in 2004. And what we did was to add some new space and remake all of the existing spaces. And you see our entrance on 53rd Street. And it's notable because unlike many museums, our entrance is on the street. If you think about the traditional museum, you go up a flight of steps and in a sense you leave the space of the street. The Museum of Modern Art has always believed that the street was the way in which you engage the energy of the city. And then we preserved what was one of the most beautiful parts of the museum, which was the garden to the north or directly behind the building. And inside that garden, we framed the two major aspects of the institution. Its research center, where our curatorial and education staff and library and archives have their offices. And on the other side, a gallery complex that was designed to provide the most optimal spaces imaginable for the display of modern and contemporary art. And you see one of our galleries devoted to the 1950s, which sets up the relationship between the Parisian school circa 1950-55 and then abstract expressionist painting that took place in New York. And we're again very grateful that Hyundai Card has been a major supporter of our new exhibition that opened a couple of weeks ago, Abstract Expressionist New York. Now, why did we do this? Why did we take the effort to remake the institution? Because we felt that in order to see, literally to see, works of art that were now 40, 50, or in some cases 100 years old, we had to provide a fresh and new context. It wasn't sufficient to simply keep them in the same galleries that they had been in for 40, 50, and in some cases 70 years. Because to do that would be to freeze them in a historical moment. And for us, a work of art is always about its meaning in the present. Again, if you think about a historical institution, its role is to locate an object in the continuum of history. Whereas our role is to place it in its present meaning. And to do that requires a kind of constant re-examination and reinvention of ourselves. And the other reason we went through this large project was to be able to show great works of contemporary art that would otherwise have been impossible to see. And I show you an installation of Richard Serra's great sculptures. Richard Serra is an American sculptor now in his 70s, and he creates these monumental steel forms weighing sometimes literally hundreds of tons. So we needed to build a building that was strong enough to support the weight of these sculptures, but spacious and open enough that we had the room in which to locate them. And my greatest fear when we opened the new museum is that this space is on the second floor of the museum. And I kept looking up as the work was being put on the floor just to make sure the ceiling wasn't about to come crashing down on everybody, because the weight of these sculptures is so great. But the point is that if you think about it, if you think about it, we needed to create a place where works of small domestic scale like this could live comfortably with large-scale works like that. And that's actually a very complicated task, because it has to do with the way you lay out space, it has to do with the relationships you create between individual discrete works of art, and it was our great challenge. So now I want to quickly forward for you to the two other dimensions of the Museum of Modern Art in the 21st century. The first is PS1, which is a Center for Contemporary Art located just across the river from Manhattan in Queens. PS stands for Public School Number 1. We merged with PS1 in 2000 in order to show works of art and architecture in particular that we would not be able to do in Manhattan. And here you see an installation from a couple of years ago. It was actually creating a living garden and farm at PS1. And another installation from a year before that literally became the setting for a summer concert series. And literally thousands of students and kids every Saturday come out here to party, to dance, and to participate in living and breathing and working within this architectural frame. And this architecture is part of a series we call the Young Architects Project, and it's the way in which we seek to engage the most vital new ideas in architecture by commissioning, often for the first time, young architects to do something innovative. But to be in the 21st century means also to be in the digital world. And so you see here our web page and are reaching out to all the various forms of social networking like Facebook, like YouTube, and like Flickr that position the museum to be a virtual space as well as a physical space. So if you think about the museum in the 21st century, we are a space on 53rd Street that's physical. We're a space that's about contemporary art and architectural practice in Queens next door. And we are a space that lives in the digital world. And what's happened to us is that about 3 million people a year visit us on site, but about 18 million people a year visit us online. So our online audience is growing at a rate that is infinitely greater than our on-site audience. And we're very proud that one of the fastest growing segments of our online audience is from Korea. So we are thrilled by your interest in what we're doing. Let me, as I move to wrap this up, also talk about the fact that what we are doing now is working with artists, commissioning them to use our building in new and innovative ways. And Doug Aitken here literally turned the exterior of our museum into a kind of multiplex where every evening he projected these scenes from different ways of perceiving New York. New York is seen by a bicycle rider, by a businessman, by a repairman, and in a way told this amazing narrative on the facade of our building. And here you see Tilda Swinton, who played the part of a business executive. And what this did was to turn the museum inside out. If you think most museums, you go in the door and you experience the objects in their isolated galleries. What Doug Aitken did for us was to turn the museum into a showcase that anyone walking down the street could see and experience. You see another image. Let me give you a couple more very quick examples of this. This is our central atrium as it looked at the time we opened the institution in 2004. This is what it looked like a couple of years later when we invited Song Dong, a young Chinese artist, to do an installation. This is actually all of the contents in his parents' house at the time of his father's death. And this is what it looked like when we invited Pippi Lodi-Rist, a young Swiss artist, and we said to her, do something daring, new, and original. So she created this overall environment in which she projected these monumental images of sort of generative forces, the earth and nature giving rise to new shapes and new forms. And then in the center of the space, put this donut. And the idea behind the donut was a kind of place that people could come and aggregate and meet and talk. And you see here another image with these wonderful sort of biomorphic forms shooting through this aqueous landscape. And then this is what happened. People started to kick off their shoes. They put their children, their young children, inside the donut. They would play with each other. And they just started to listen to the sounds of the piece, look at the images, and feel utterly overwhelmed by this work. And this sense of participation is, I think, what's at the heart of what people are looking for when they come to the museum. If you think about the traditional object, it sits on a wall or sits on the floor, and you have an exogenous relationship to it. You and it share a space, but you don't share a relationship other than what you can construct. I think the art that is most engaging today is art that invites you as a visitor, as a viewer, to participate in its making. So here's a work by Roman Andak called Measuring Your Space, in which anyone who enters a room is invited to simply have his or her name inscribed on the wall and their height. And then after a while, this is what the wall begins to look like, as thousands and then tens of thousands of people literally are inscribed in the museum, until eventually you're left with this. And think about it. For every one of those visitors to the Museum of Modern Art, they have left a trace of who they are. Their visit is no longer anonymous. They are literally written into the history of the institution. And art that can do that can transform you from being someone casually visiting the museum to you being as important as literally every line in the building, as every shape and every form, makes this a kind of participatory art that moves in a very new and different direction. And then finally, Marina Abramovic, a performance artist, took this idea of performance and invitation and participation to a new level, where she simply sat, as part of her retrospective called The Artist is Present, she sat in a chair and invited anyone who wanted to just come and sit with her for as long or as short as they wanted to. Some people sat for 8 hours, a whole day, while literally 5 and sometimes 10,000 people watched. And some people only sat for 15 or 20 minutes. But the reality was, she made you witness and participate in the creation of a work of art. And live broadcasting streamed onto the internet, so anyone could see in real time her sitting, and in this case, Arthur Danto, a famous philosopher, sitting with each other. So that this notion of the museum existing on the net and the museum existing in real space were fused together in this work that operated simultaneously. And that brings me to a conclusion. Thank you very much.